Congratulations, you have taken the first step. Now, let's explore the differences between spoken discourse and written discourse. We can observe three major differences between something spoken and something written. In this regard, written discourse and spoken discourse. These differences are grammatical, lexical, and structural. Now let's look at these differences one by one. Let's talk about grammatical differences. The first obvious difference is in the sentence structure. Spoken discourse usually uses shorter sentences, while written discourse uses longer, complex, and compound sentences. Next obvious distinction is in the contractions, such as in spoken discourse we usually say I'm, or I don't, or I won't, but in written discourse, if it's formal, we usually write I am, I don't. We tend to use the words fully, without contracting them. Next distinction is called disfluences. Sometimes it's also called fillers. The words like uh-huh, the markers that show that you are hesitating. In written discourse, these are usually omitted, but when you are giving a spontaneous speech, you cannot actually leave it out, or you cannot stop yourself saying these words unless you edit your video. Another difference is in the use of pronouns. For example, in spoken speech, we can show because the context is happening in real time, such as we can say, put this here. However, imagine taking this note at home from your mom. So your mom sends you a message saying, put this here. And written discourse, it may not mean anything. So here, in this context, you don't understand what is this and where is here. That's why written discourse usually uses clear referencing words. Tense and aspect is another interesting point. For example, written discourse uses usually high-level tenses. By this high level, I mean the tenses that you learn in higher level of English, such as past perfect continuous or present perfect continuous. But in spoken speech, we hardly ever use them unless the context requires. You can guess this one very easily. Punctuation and capitalization. When we are speaking, there is no capitalization, and we do not actually say the capitalization out. I mean, we do not say, I finished my sentence, full stop. Organization is the last difference. In written discourse, sentences tend to be more logical, and they are put in an organization, while in spoken discourse, the user might speak the sentences in a disorganized way, but anyway convey meaning. Now, let's look at the lexical differences in the word choice. The first difference is the level of vocabulary, such as using formal vocabulary or informal vocabulary. Naturally, our spoken discourse tends to be informal, while in written discourse we are more selective and use advanced words. Well, imagine using advanced words in spoken speech to someone you know. This might sound ironically, doesn't it? Second lexical difference is repetition. Well, in spoken discourse, we tend to repeat the same word in order to emphasize on a point. But in written discourse, we tend to use synonyms or antonyms or meronyms, and we try to repeat the same word over and over in order to create cohesion. This is something that we're going to discuss in later videos. Idiomatic expressions are also very interesting to analyze. Well, in spoken discourse, we usually use idiomatic expressions frequently, while we tend to avoid using idioms or other phrasal verbs in written discourse, because something written is usually regarded as something formal. Tone is also very different in both discourses. For example, in written discourse, we usually tend to be more formal. We tend to use longer sentences and we tend to be more selective in vocabulary. While in speech, we tend to be more conversational. That's why we can use informal tone. Last lexical difference is in the word formation. By this I mean, in spoken discourse, we tend to be spontaneous in forming the words. We can create new words while speaking, or we can address to any form of the word in speech. But in written discourse, we tend to stick to a certain vocabulary. Now, let's talk about structural differences. As I have mentioned above, written discourse uses longer sentences. Sometimes they try to address compound sentences, complex sentences, or both compound complex sentences. And someone who is writing tries to vary the language by using different structures of the sentence. While in speech, we tend to use simpler sentences and we tend to stick to the same structure of the sentences. Another distinction is in creating paragraphs. Can you imagine writing something in paragraphs? Yes, but can you imagine speaking in paragraphs? Absolutely not, because when we are speaking, our speech is usually disorganized, or we tend not to have introduction, body paragraph, supportive sentences, and conclusion, unless it's highly formal language, or unless it's a formal report, unless we practiced it several times before giving the speech. Coherence cohesion is also very important. In written discourse, we tend to use cohesive devices more, such as first of all, secondly, lastly, or some contrasting conjunctions like however, nevertheless, nonetheless. In speech, we tend to use more simpler words such as but and and. Now, ask a question from yourself. What was the last time you used nevertheless, or however, or although in your speech? Many days ago. But how about and but? One more difference is in turn taking. In conversations or in spoken discourse, usually we have 2 or 3 partners, which means these speakers speak in turns. But written discourse tends to be one way, that's why it doesn't have turn taking. Let's talk about nonverbal cues. Nonverbal cues are gestures and mimes. In written discourse, you cannot show your gestures, can you? For example, can you show this? Can you show this? Absolutely no. You can describe it, but nonverbal actions are hard to explain in written discourse. But in spoken discourse, while we are talking to someone, we can frown without saying anything, or we can point at someone by showing. However, this is hard to explain in written discourse. So in short, written discourse does not use nonverbal cues a lot. And last obvious distinction is in the narration. By this I mean, written discourse tend to tell stories. That's why they have got its generic structure, such as the writer first of all gives you the abstract, then the events, the climax, the resolution, and the coda. But in spoken discourse, we tend not to follow this organization strictly. Okay, we have seen all differences between spoken discourse and written discourse. To quickly recap, we said there are 3 differences: grammatical, lexical, and structural. Do you have any questions on written discourse or on spoken discourse? Never hesitate to ask in the comments section. Now, it's time to check your understanding. Let's take the test.